It's a great pleasure and privilege, really, to be addressing you in the 21st session of the Mises University, and especially in this introductory lecture on the life and achievements of Ludwig von Mises. Of course, my talk is going to be very limited, and you take that into account, but especially it's going to pale to triviality, really, compared to a work that's going to be coming out probably in the spring, and that is the definitive biography of Ludwig von Mises by Dr. Guido Hülsmann. Guido has spent years researching the archives in the United States, in Vienna, in Moscow, where many of Mises' papers, for some reason, finally wound up. And I had occasion to read Professor Hülsmann's biography of Mises in typescript, and I tell you that it is not only going to be the definitive biography of Mises, not only a magnificent work of the history of the Austrian school altogether, but in my opinion, one of the great works of the history of ideas of our part of the 21st century. So that's at the publishers now, and it's going to be available, I would think, sometime in the spring. In the meantime, short of that, there's a very brief introduction to the life and thought of Mises, which is available from the Mises Institute by Murray Rothbard, called Ludwig von Mises, Scholar, Creator, Hero. And Murray was very close to Mises, very familiar with his work, a continuer of his work in an important sense, so that this is, I think, also online, or else you can easily pick up a copy of this Ludwig von Mises, Scholar, Creator, Hero. I don't know what this is about, so I'll just forget this. Every time I come here, Jeff Tucker has some new high-tech thing that I have to get used to somehow. I still don't know what an iPod is, but forget that. Many years ago, William Buckley was at the beginning, many years ago, at the beginning of his career of lecturing at colleges, and then he was, in those days, more tolerant of libertarians than he is today. And often, he used to begin his talks by writing two names on the board, and he would try to, in that way, dramatize the point that the students in his average American students in his audience were only being presented with one side of the great world-forming debate between capitalism and socialism. The name of the defender of democratic socialism, I think it was usually John Kenneth Galbraith. You can feel free to hiss very low. That name, Galbraith's name, was recognized by almost all the students. The name of Ludwig von Mises was entirely unknown to them. And this was a dramatic contrast. He asked the students, and many of them would have to wonder, how come, if he's the great defender of capitalism, we've never heard of him? And needless to say, the situation has not basically improved, except in the sense that more college students recognize the name of William F. Buckley, Jr. Now, how has it been possible that even the great majority of economics and social science students at fine universities and colleges are completely unfamiliar with Mises and his work? When he died in October 1973, even the New York Times, in its notice at the time of his death, called Mises one of the foremost economists of the century. And Milton Friedman, who certainly had his differences with Mises, comes from a totally different tradition in economics, called Mises, quote, one of the great economists of all time. But Mises was even more than a great economist. Throughout the world, among knowledgeable people, in German-speaking Europe, in France, in Britain, in Latin America, in our own country, Mises was famous as the great 20th century champion of a certain school of thought. This school of thought might be said to have a certain historical importance and a certain intellectual respectability. The one that began with John Locke continued through the 18th century with Adam. That had better be a martini. The one that and continued with Adam Smith, David Hume, the great Turgot in France, included Wilhelm von Humboldt, Jeremy Bentham. By the way, if you haven't heard of a lot of these names, it goes back to the reason I mentioned before. Your professors, for some reason, decided not to reveal them to you, although just take my word for it, they're very important in the history of ideas. This school continued with Jeremy Bentham, Benjamin Constant. It included Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexis de Tocqueville, Lord Acton, Karl Menger, boehm-bawerk, William Graham Sumner, Herbert Spencer, Wilfredo Pareto, and many others. A school that goes on for over 200 years, that is known as the tradition of classical liberalism. And Mises was recognized by the classical liberals of his own time as the foremost representative in the 20th century of this school. Offhand, one would have thought that this acknowledged position alone would have entitled Mises to being presented within the so pluralistic setting of American left liberal academe. Right, they're so broad-minded. I mean, the spectrum of acceptable opinion goes from maybe Galbraith to John Dewey or somebody. And then there were Mises' scientific achievements, which were extraordinary. There's his pioneering work in monetary theory and the theory of the business cycle, continued today by scholars like Joe Salerno and Roger Garrison and others that who are present here. His profound work in the methodology of economics and the a priori derivation of economic truth, his systematizing of all of economic theory in his magnum opus, Human Action. And there are other important contributions. For instance, it is conceded on all sides that the whole discussion revolving around the viability of a system of central economic planning, in this discussion, Mises played the key role. And that was really an important issue throughout the 20th century, right? Whether a socialist system could function or not. Quite possibly, and I would say probably really, the great intellectual scandal still unadmitted of the 20th century was that the vast international Marxist movement, including thousands upon thousands of professional thinkers in all fields. For instance, Albert Einstein. Einstein had a pamphlet, "Profits Not Peoples." I'm sorry, that's the right way of looking at it. People, not profits. And I look at it sometime. I mean, I don't know. It's on an undergraduate level, and that's from a super genius like Einstein. Anyway, there are tens of thousands of intellectuals like that, and they thought it was perfectly okay for generation after generation to view the whole issue of capitalism versus socialism solely in terms of the alleged defects of capitalism. Capitalism was responsible for every single thing that's wrong with humanity. From divorce or the dissolution of the family to the continued existence of the family, just across the board, and on all of these terrible things, which would be finally solved when socialism came. So it was only the defects of capitalism that attracted the attention of these great intellectuals. The question of how and how well a socialist economy would function was avoided as taboo. It was Mises' accomplishment and a sign of his superb, I would say unrivaled, independence of mind, to have brushed aside this pious, one doesn't speak of such things, and to have presented comprehensively and arrestingly the problems inherent in attempting rational economic calculation in a situation where no market exists for production goods. Okay. This was the fatal flaw of the communist system. This was the fatal flaw from the beginning. No reforms could help that, do away with that, and finally, it led to the collapse of communism. Communism in the Soviet Union didn't collapse because the United States increased the defense budget. They could have, if they had had the sentiment of the people behind them, they simply could have tightened the screws on the public, siphoned off more and more of society's wealth for their military purposes. But the time finally came when, with the information revolution and the ability of first the elite and then the masses in Russia to see what was happening in market economies, even the elite, even the privileged elite, lost faith in the system. That is, how many decades would they have to go through of poverty, of misery, of standard of living lower than Portugal, lower than Brazil, lower with consumer goods not available that were available to blacks in South Africa. The time came when the elite lost faith in the system and were not willing to fight for it. And the fatal flaw was there from the beginning, and that was the impossibility of rational economic calculation, and Mises had put his finger on it from the start. So it was the irrationality, the economic irrationality inherent in the socialist system that finally brought communism down. Well, I mean, considering that really was a rather important development, Mises deserves credit for having been the pioneer in pointing it out and developing the critique. There's a good article which I'm sure is on the archives of the Free Market by Lew Rockwell, called "Heart of a Fighter," about Mises. And I recommend this to you very strongly in regard to Mises' accomplishments, but also particularly in regard to the inner strength that Mises always showed. And where did Mises, by the way, maybe you know this, where did Mises come out with this critique of socialism? Well, in his first book, 1922, called Socialism. That is 1922 in the German edition. And I like this sentence particularly from Lew's article. If you have never read it, I can only describe the effect that this book might have on someone who is sympathetic with socialism. It is akin to playing chess against a genuine master who seems to be tightening the noose with every move. By the time you have reached the end, it produces the kind of shock that delivers the most dedicated socialist from intellectual illusion. And that's exactly what it did when it came out in 1922. As we know from the historical record, as we know in particular from Friedrich Hayek, F.A. Hayek, who wrote the introduction to the Liberty Press edition of Socialism. And he said when this book came out in 1922, well, Hayek had fought in the First World War, as so many others had in Central Europe. And Hayek said we were all, almost to a man, idealistic socialists or sympathetic to socialism. This came as a breath of fresh air, as a bucket of cold water over our heads and converted Hayek from this dalliance with socialism that he had as a young man. He would have been 23 at that time, but also to writers and thinkers around Europe, to Lionel Robbins in London, who then became the head of the London School of Economics, free market economists. In Germany, an economist named boehm-bawerk, who afterwards became the leading light behind the German economic miracle of Ludwig Erhard. And in this way, it was an event of historical importance, the appearance of Mises's book. And it was fought, of course, it was fought against. It was attacked bitterly by socialists and communists. The debate went on for a long time, and the economics profession, predictably enough, came to the conclusion that Mises, seconded by Hayek, had lost the debate, and that socialism was perfectly feasible. It was one of the last, I think that Hans probably can give details on this, one of the last editions of Samuelson's text on economics, his great economics text, where he talks about socialist economies and how they seem to be quite competitive. I remember Galbraith wrote an article saying that in the near future they'll be more than competitive, because in a socialist economy you don't have people wasting their time being merchants and bankers and traders and capitalists. They can actually do work. This is from a Harvard economics professor who goes back to the oldest, dumbest, really Saint-Simonian argument against capitalism for socialism. Under socialism, you'll have more people who can carry things, and that's certainly going to be a plus for the economy. Well, finally, with the collapse, they actually needed after all the misery, you know, I mean, aside from the terror, I was in the Soviet Union in Gorbachev's time, so late in the regime when they were starting with the reforms and so on, and I was there with a group from the Cato Institute. They were having a conference. But the first time I'd been in Moscow and then in what was called Leningrad in those days. But Moscow, you have to understand, in the Soviet Union, as in all communist countries, the capital city got the best of everything. So that you can judge from what was available in Moscow to what was available, you know, in Irkutsk, Vladivostok, and so on. And you know, we went to Gum's department store on Red Square. I mean, you know, the Soviet people were victims of all this, but I suppose they thought that was their Bloomingdale's. Well, I can tell you stories about it, but it really was pathetic. So this was the outcome of 70 years of socialism, and then so finally, some of the socialists had the decency. Here's Robert Heilbrunner in an article where he discusses this in the middle 90s. Robert Heilbrunner was the author of probably the most popular text on the history of economic thought. I mean, it was really popular, kind of, I don't know, sensationalistic almost, but sold a lot of copies. And here in an article, it talks about this debate on economic calculation, and he says, it turns out, of course, that Mises was right. Well, of course, sure, after all those years. Well, okay, so this is part of Mises' intellectual achievement. So, how can we account for the fact that the intellectuals and professors and so on, who lionized men like Raymond Aron, to my mind a very banal Keynesian, and Sir Isaiah Berlin, to my mind a high-level popularizer of ideas, and praise them to the skies. They praise these men as seriously as important social philosophers, and somehow they could never bring themselves to familiarize their students with Mises or to show him the marks of public recognition and respect that were his due. When Mises taught at New York University, his salary was not even paid by New York University. It was paid for by the Volcker Fund. Just as Hayek's salary at Chicago was paid for by outside sources, not by the University of Chicago. In fact, he taught on the Committee on Social Thought, which is where I and some friends and associates got our degree, because Hayek could not get a job in the economics department at the University of Chicago, the economics department of George Stigler and Milton Friedman, because Hayek was not considered a scientific economist because he was an Austrian. Now, part of the answer to the question of why Mises was so neglected lies, I think, in what Jacques Rueff, in a warm tribute, called his intransigence. Mises was admittedly a complete doctrinaire, not a dogmatist. Nothing was based on faith, but a doctrinaire, a relentless and implacable fighter for his doctrine. For over 60 years, he was at war with the spirit of his age, with every one of the advancing, victorious, or merely modish collectivist political schools, left and right. Decade after decade, he fought militarism, protectionism, inflationism, every variety of socialism, every policy of the interventionist state, and through most of that time he stood alone or close to it. You know, in 1936, one of the co-founders of the Chicago School of Economics, Frank Knight, voted for the Communist Party candidate for president. Now, I don't know whether that was some kind of protest or something, but Chicago was certainly not on the same side as Mises in those days. As I say, Mises was virtually alone. Imagine the inner courage it takes for that, the inner directedness. The totality and enduring intensity of Mises's battle could only be fueled from a profound inner sense of the truth and supreme value of the ideas for which he was struggling. This, as well as his temperament, one supposes, helped produce a definite arrogance, you might say, or some people thought, in his tone, or apodictic quality, as some of us in the Mises seminar fondly called it, using one of his favorite words. And such arrogance, if you want to call it that, was the last thing academic left liberals and social democrats could accept in the defender of a view they considered only marginally worthy of toleration to begin with. So he really annoyed them. This would largely account, I think, for the somewhat greater recognition that has been accorded to Friedrich Hayek, even before Hayek's greatly deserved Nobel Prize. Hayek was temperamentally much more moderate in expression than Mises ever was. Hayek explicitly neglected to accept, really, in fact, occasionally denounced the old slogan of laissez-faire. And I know that people do intellectual history, especially of our people, in such a sloppy way. I could, if I had the time, cite a dozen authors, a dozen economists mostly, who said that Hayek was a defender of laissez-faire. How many times does he have to say that he does not believe in laissez-faire before we take him at his word? But Mises reveled in calling himself an advocate of laissez-faire. And it's hard to imagine Mises making such a gesture as Hayek did. Hayek dedicated the road to serfdom to socialists of all parties. Mises would never do that. That would be like Ayn Rand dedicating the Atlas Shrugged to thugs of all descriptions. But the lack of recognition deflected Mises not in the least. Not in the least. I think George will second that impression, George, having been at Mises' seminar, as I was also. Instead, Mises continued his work decade after decade, accumulating contributions to economic theory, developing the theoretical structure of the Austrian school, and in his understanding of the laws of economic activity, elaborating, correcting, and bringing up to date the great social philosophy of classical liberalism. And many of his books, I think, are available online or easily available now from Liberty Press. One that's sometimes neglected is Nation, State, and Economy, which is a very important, early and very important book of Mises, especially for nowadays, considering all the ethnic conflicts that exist in the world, murderous ethnic conflicts, where he proposes, first of all, a strictly limited central government, but more than that, the right of secession of different ethnic communities that feel that they might be threatened as minorities within larger political organizations, and down to provinces, down to communities, and he said, if feasible, down to households. Well, as maybe I'll explain in my next talk on liberalism, the right of secession, I think, is central to any chances freedom might have. Now, one of Mises' great books that is probably less noted than his major works in economics is Theory and History. It is sometimes forgotten that Mises was all his life an ardent student of history. You might think that is incongruous in somebody who believed in a priori laws of human action, but not in the least, as he explains in Theory and History, how the study of history is in fact quite important. And it was his understanding of economic principles, I believe, that enabled him to penetrate to the heart of crucial historical questions when professional historians could not. I'll cite just two examples. A question that has occupied economic historians in recent decades is what's called the European miracle. And I will deal with that when I talk about liberalism. Why did economic growth occur in the West and not elsewhere in the world? And many years ago, in one of his essays, before the creation of much of this immense literature on why Europe is different, Mises identifies the underlying reason. The idea of liberty is and always has been peculiar to the West. The East lacked the primordial thing, the idea of freedom from the state. It never called into question the arbitrariness of the despots. And first of all, it never established the legal framework that would protect the private citizen's wealth and get against confiscation on the part of tyrants. Now, as I say, I'll go into detail, flesh that out in my discussion of the rise of liberalism. But this is the heart of the explanation that by now numerous fine scholars have given to the European miracle. By Europe, I mean not just Europe, but the outposts of Europe, especially America. This has been developed by Rosenberg and Birdsall in their book, How the West Grew Rich, by Douglas North in the works that earned him a Nobel Prize. But this is the point, that why did the West grow rich? Well, Mises already had it back there. The West developed the idea of the limits on the part of the limits on the predatory state, the limits on their power to tax, on their power to confiscate, on their infringements of individual freedom, and so on. This was developed over centuries in the West, and it does not have an analog in the history of other civilizations. Or we can take the question of the Industrial Revolution. I don't know what it's, I mean, with my students it just never works. They always have a picture in the back of their mind that was planted God knows where, where was in their grade schools and high schools. of the Industrial Revolution as a plague that descended on the working class. It's like nowadays 50% of the American people believe that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction when the United States invaded. Nothing is going to change that view. Nothing has changed that view. Even the people in charge in Washington saying, no, they didn't have any weapons of mass destruction, that doesn't change the view. And similarly with this view of the Industrial Revolution, it was it was a catastrophe. But Hayek has edited a really nice little book called Capitalism and the Historians, many years ago, 1952 or something. And this myth of the immiseration of the working class in the Industrial Revolution is the supreme historical myth of socialism. It has done more than any other idea to erode belief in the system of the free economy. Because after all, there was laissez-faire in 19th century Britain, and look, terrible, terrible things. Women had to go to work for the first time. The first time in history, women had to go to work. All right. In previous pre-capitalist days, they used to go to classes in Italian opera and jewelry making and so on, and sell it on Telegraph Avenue. But the capitalists forced them to go to work. Well, Mises pointed out that the context, the indispensable context for understanding the Industrial Revolution is the population explosion that hit Western and Central Europe, and really all of Eurasia, from the 18th century, mid-18th century on. Here's England alone. No, I don't even want to try that. Here, you can put down some dates: 1750, 1800, 1850, 1900. You can put those down, I said. Okay, it's not just a suggestion. I put it in the form of a suggestion just to be gentlemanly about it. Okay, in 1750, England had a population of 6 million, and it had never been more than that. By 1800, the population had increased to 12 million. 50 years later, it was 24 million. Okay, 4 times what it had been a century before. Unprecedented. And then by 1900, the population of England was 42 million. And you have similar numbers for Germany, and this doesn't count massive emigration. You had similar numbers for other countries. The only exception was France, for reasons peculiar to itself. So, this unprecedented population explosion, as Mises pointed out, is what you have to understand if you want to understand what happened during the Industrial Revolution. What happened during the Industrial Revolution was industrialization, which created the possibility of survival for these new tens of millions of people. As Mises pointed out, they could not have survived in the old economy, in the old restrictive mercantilist economy. And it was laissez-faire, cracking open the barriers of mercantilism that permitted them to survive, and then soon after to become the richest working people that ever lived in the world under this free enterprise system. As the economic historian T.S. Ashton wrote, if you want to see a country that experienced a population explosion and without an industrial revolution, then go to Calcutta. Or go to Ireland in the 19th century. So what I'm getting at is this, that Mises was not a professional historian, but Mises' great insight into the laws of human action, into economic science, and his great reading of history permitted him to get to the essence of the issue on why the West grew rich, for instance, critical question like that, on the question of the Industrial Revolution, similarly a critical question as well. Now, Mises was, to my mind and the mind of many other people, the great classical liberal of the 20th century. But distinctions can be made among classical liberals. Take an example of Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. Tocqueville is extremely popular among everybody nowadays. And you have to wonder, how is it everybody can quote Tocqueville, no matter pretty much what their point of view is. And that is that he's pretty much of a contradictory author. I mean, tends to contradict himself from one chapter to another, although he has brilliant insights, no doubt. Now, Tocqueville in Democracy in America says, "Nothing conceivable is so petty, so insipid, so crowded with paltry interests, in a word, so anti-poetic as the life of a man in the United States." Comes from somebody who was able to live off the rents of the tenants on his ancestral estates. Whether or not this judgment is true, Mises would never have bothered to make it. As a utilitarian liberal, he had more respect for the standards by which ordinary people judge the quality of their own lives. It is highly doubtful that Mises felt any of the qualms of liberals like Tocqueville at the Americanization of the world. In fact, their attitude towards America, not the American government, obviously, but to American society and American capitalism, would be a good rough criterion for categorizing classical liberals as radical or conservative, I would say. Mises then was a radical liberal in the line of the men of Manchester and other of the great classical liberals of the mid and later 19th century. All of the elements of radical liberalism are there. First of all, and most basically, his uncompromising rationalism, reiterated again and again. And that comes out explicitly that man has only his reason to depend on, and everything that we value in civilization comes from man's reason. There is his concern with human welfare, not in any aggregative sense, and certainly not directed by the government, but as men and women individually define it for themselves. There's his championing of peace in the tradition of the 19th century liberals, most identified with the doctrine of complete laissez-faire, Richard Cobden and John Bright, Frederick Bastiat and Herbert Spencer. And peace based on the economic substructure of free trade. And there is in Mises fundamentally what you could even call, although don't misunderstand this, a democratic outlook. Certainly not to be understood in terms of some innate equality of talents, which he denied, and certainly insisted on the basic inequality of human beings from nature, and or understood in some sense of equality of income. When Mises discusses the great questions of equality, he does not have in mind some future utopia where each will absolutely count for one and none for more than one, but rather the empirical, the real conditions under which human beings have hitherto found themselves in various societies. What have actually been the conditions of class, status, degree, privilege in the history of mankind throughout the ages? And what difference does capitalism make? The history of pre-capitalist societies is one of slavery, serfdom, and caste and class privileges in the most degrading form. It is history made by slave owners, warrior nobles, kings, their mistresses and courtiers, the state-sponsored priests and other Mandarin intellectuals, by parasites and oppressors of all description. Capitalism shifts the whole center of gravity of society. You know, when Cornwallis's forces were about to embark at Yorktown, the band played "The World Turned Upside Down," as indeed it had been by the American Revolution. These farmers defeating the British Empire. In the hackneyed but true and sociologically enormously important statement, every dollar, whether in the possession of someone totally lacking in the social graces, nobody at the Mises Institute would fit that description, certainly. Every dollar in the hands of someone of mean birth, of a Jew, a black, someone no one even heard of, is equal of every other dollar and commands products and services on the market which talented people must structure their lives to provide. Mises maintained that the pseudo-revolution which socialism would bring about is much more likely to lead to the re-emergence of the society of status and the re-degradation of the masses to the position of pawns controlled by an elite which would assign itself the title role in the heroic melodrama, man consciously makes his own history. Well, a good deal more can be said about Mises, the individual. Mises, the man whom I knew, George knew, Murray, of course, was very close to. And it's impossible to convey to you what his presence meant, what impression he made, especially on younger people as we were in those days. There was, first of all, his immense scholarship, which brings to mind other German-speaking scholars like Max Weber and Joseph Schumpeter, who seemed to work on the principle that someday all the encyclopedias would vanish from the shelves in the libraries. So they had to have all of this stuff in their own minds. There was a Cartesian clarity of his presentations in class, his respect for the life of reason, evident in every gesture and glance, his courtesy and kindliness and understanding, even to beginners. His real wit, he was a funny guy. Hayek, unfortunately, too reserved. I don't remember Hayek making any even attempt at a witty remark. But Mises was first of all Jewish, so he had that going for him. But he had this wit that was proverbially bred in the great cities, like the wit of Berliners, Parisians, New Yorkers, and was Viennese, and there's a softer touch to it. Well, let me just say, to have at an early point come to know the great Mises tends to create in one's mind lifelong standards of what an ideal intellectual should be. I've never encountered anybody who met that standard, and I doubt that there are too many, or any at all really, have been in recent years in the United States. But you know, talking about two different types of people, really. And the average run of college professor, even at Princeton or Chicago or whatever, is just not in that league. Now, I don't mean to say that Mises was infallible. Nobody's infallible. I don't mean to say that Mises was always correct, or that Mises was the last word. No thinker is the last word. I like to think of, I like to go back and consider Thomas Jefferson, for instance. When Jefferson was preparing his speeches for the disestablishment of the Episcopal Church of Virginia, he used John Locke's famous Letters on Toleration as a starting point. And John Locke and Jeff was in favor of toleration as a general view, but Jefferson took that as a starting point and built on it, because John Locke was not in favor of tolerating atheists or Roman Catholics. Atheists, because he said you can't depend on them to keep a promise, and Roman Catholics, this Protestant view, because they obey, pardon me, a foreign prince, namely the Pope. So there were limits to John Locke's great belief in toleration. And so Jefferson said, we go beyond that. He said, we're going to have complete toleration in matters of religion. And he wrote in his notes, it was a great thing to go as far as Locke did, but where he stopped short, we may go on. And I would say that about Mises also, and especially, I would, in my opinion, in regard to the improvement, the enrichment of his thought by the man I consider his most important follower, Murray Rothbard. Mises had a strange antiseptic view of the state. Let me see if I can find the quote. The state exists, he says, to bludgeon wrongdoers, beat them into submission. If they try to, oh yes, here. He says the state is just the apparatus of compulsion and coercion. Nietzsche wrote that the state is the coldest of all cold monsters, and Mises, and this I think is the only attempted humorous line in his book on liberalism, said the state is neither cold nor warm. Well, that was it anyway, sorry. All state activity is human activity, and the goal is the preservation of society. What Mises, I think, does not consider is that the state has a dynamism of its own. Once a state apparatus is put in place, in the long run, what are the chances of limiting the state, of having limited government? And I think this is a question that Murray Rothbard brought up. It's a question which is being considered by a number of the scholars at the Mises Institute. And all I'm saying is what Jefferson said about Locke. That is, obviously he was a great man. Obviously he gave us the foundation. But it's not the end of the story, and we can go on from there also. Well, let me finally say that Mises is, to me and to a number of people, a culture hero, besides being, as Murray indicates in his book, besides being a great economist, great thinker, great social philosopher, because there was something about his life. And culture hero would be someone like Galileo, for instance, a great scientist, but also something about his life. Or Beethoven, of course, a great composer, but something about his life that makes him very special, and there was that about Mises. One of the good things, one of the best things that's happened in my life is that I have known a good many very smart people. Murray Rothbard, of course, Bob Nozick, Ayn Rand, the Chicago people, in those days, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, Thomas Saz, the great anti-psychiatry psychiatrist, Hayek. But I tell you that of all these very smart people, all these brilliant people I've known, I think now still that Mises was the most brilliant, and it's a great tribute to Lew Rockwell that he has now founded this institute named after Ludwig von Mises to continue to spread his thought. Thank you.